Now what this is going to be about is just certain characters that rode with McNeill. It's not a story about a battle or things like that. So I'll be throwing things in, maybe out of sequence, things that happened. I'll tell you about somebody and said, well, this happened in 1865, and then we'll jump back to the next person. And so it won't be in sequence all the way through. But this is a strained print that all you're familiar with. What I wanted to ask you, on some of these people, did they go around to relatives to get pictures of them or anything like that? And I know they could get Jesse McNeill and John Hanson, yeah. But some of the others.
I think a Judy is in here.
Yeah,
I think they went to.
And we have a picture of Joe A.
Right.
Okay. Virginia had that. Okay,
so that's what he used. So this shows him going, I think it's in 1862 in Moorefield, and it gives you a good idea of him. And,
is that building still there?
It's a church, isn't it?
It's a church. Is it still there? Church.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay.
So let's go to the next one. Here's Captain McNeill, just quickly. He fights early in the war out in Missouri, and he's wounded at the Battle of Springfield. Later on, he's captured. As he's recovering, captured along with his son Jesse. They escape eventually, not at the same time, but at different times, and they make their way back here. And when they come back here, what's known as the Partisan Ranger Act has passed. And a partisan ranger was between a regular soldier and a guerrilla. And what was the reason they passed this act, the Confederate Congress, was that a lot of Southerners like to be guerrillas, like to be bushwhackers. But when the Union Army caught them, which they would, they'd execute them on the spot. So this Partisan Ranger Act said if you put together a company, a regiment, or battalion, or regiment of infantry or cavalry and sign up as Partisan Rangers, you can keep what you capture and turn it into, sell it back to the Confederate government. You receive wages from the Confederate government. But it gave if they signed up as a partisan, it gave them certain protections. Now this didn't go into effect right away because as the partisans were formed, a lot of Union officers or Union authorities didn't recognize that. Finally, it was recognized as because something had happened in Hampshire County. In Bowdoin, and McNeill and his men were also involved in this, captured some Union soldiers at Paw Paw and Little Cacaven. When the Union soldiers went to Richmond, they were in limbo. They couldn't be exchanged because the Union authorities didn't recognize the Partisan Ranger Act. So Buchanan's ex-Secretary of State, a man named Jeremiah Black from Pennsylvania, he arranged with Confederate authorities, and they said they would start recognizing these Partisan Rangers. But he joins up with in Bowdoin, but when Bowdoin goes into the military, regular army with his men, he stays out with about 18 of his followers. Next. This is the area, all of you are familiar with this, the basic area they operated in. They would go into Pennsylvania, they would go into Maryland, but this section, the South Branch Valley, Potomac Highlands, that's where they're going to be. And their basic modus operandi is ambush. Ambush of wagon trains going to Petersburg, the military post in Petersburg that was established in 1863. Couriers, ambushing couriers as they came along, and so on. And hay trains, as we'll talk about in a little bit.
Steve,
yes.
Who did they report
to? He is reporting to in Bowdoin. But when he's out in Bowdoin's eyesight, he's not reporting to anyone. Right. If in Bowdoin, Kentucky, he reports to him.
That's interesting.
If he's over at the other side of town, he doesn't.
That's,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Keeps a good eats for himself.
right.
When they say, in Mercersburg, Pennsylvania, they ask, why aren't you doing this like Robert E. Lee told you to? And one of them said, we are guerrillas, we go and come as we please. And that was kind of the deal. If you fight for us under the Partisan Ranger Act, we'll give you this protection, and you'll kind of be on a long leash. And by 1864, the winter of 1864, the long leash was too long, not as for much of McNeill or Mosby, but for the other guerrillas or partisans. Jesse James is a partisan.
I didn't.
Frank James is a partisan. Quantrell's a partisan, right?
Yeah.
So it's more or less at the beginning here, and it's at the beginning in the war. It's as Partisan Rangers, it's a for-profit operation, for-profit.
So they were only recognized because of prisoner exchange. Is that what you
Right.
basically
Finally, they had to exchange those prisoners. There were about 160 prisoners from Pennsylvania, and they were in limbo. They couldn't be exchanged
said? And that was the
to trade for another soldier. They were in limbo, and that's finally put it in.
So the Union side didn't recognize that their own men had been captured because they were
Right.
captured by partisan rangers?
Right.
They just let them sit in jail?
Right.
That's yeah, that's
Yeah.
that's
And at the end of and after February 1864, Robert E. Lee didn't recognize any partisans except McNeill or Mosby. He sent all the others. The Secretary of War sent all the others back into the regular service. Of course, most of them became just highwaymen and guerrillas. So they didn't. So we'll go. But that's the area. All you know this area they operated in. Lots of mountains, lots of rough areas that they can hide in. And that's what Captain Keyes said after the ambush of the wagon train out here at Junction. How you going to catch him? He's going back into his lair. They're going into the mountains. How are you supposed to catch him?
Steve, I do have a quick question while I've got the map up there.
Yeah.
I've been giving tours up on the trenches there, and it talks about the raid from out of Rockingham County up to ultimately burn the Fairmont Bridge, the bridge of Fairmont. And
Right.
And then they sent the guys out of the Fort Mill Ridge battery to guard the Greenwood Gap. Was McNeill's in that?
Yes, he was in. He was in with Jones.
Okay, and when they took the wagon, the forage wagons earlier on, a few months before that?
Yes.
That was McNeill's?
Yes. McNeill's idea was that Jones and Bowdoin raid.
Right.
Lee took it away from him and put Jones in command.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, next one. Here's Jesse McNeill. You see he's a Beau Brummel. Most Confederate soldiers are not going to dress like that during the war. This is probably towards the end of the war. We'll have another picture later. But he always had the best clothes. They would buy the clothes at Harrisonburg from the spoils, some of their capture wagons, and they would not want the wagons as much as they would want the horses and mules. And some of these auctions in Harrisonburg would go $20,000, $30,000, $40,000. And then they would divide that amongst themselves, and they were the best dressed of all the
It
Confederates.
looks like he has a big attitude.
He was a heavy drinker during the early part of the war, but not towards the end, not after his father died.
He looked good in GQ, GQ magazine. He looked like
Yeah,
one of the models.
He's
GQ. Really, you know?
He's only in his
He's got
early
that
20s.
attitude.
He's only in his early 20s there. But he's in the whole way with, he escapes, of course, from Missouri, a prison there, and he makes his way through through Tennessee, coming back by himself, and he passes through the aftermath of the Battle of Shiloh, and he had his wife, a Sherrard from the Moorefield, Petersburg area, she, in 1927, her birthday party, she was talking about him helping on this trip back. He stopped at Shiloh and helped nurse some of the soldiers on the way back. But when they formed this company, he's going to be the first lieutenant. So he's right down from his father, and he's a real fighter the whole way through. No doubt about that. It's only after his father dies or is mortally wounded that some of the other soldiers question whether he should be put in command. And of course, his father placed him in command, but they made him, or they asked him to take a vow he wouldn't drink anymore, and he did. And of course, he's going to take over as the head of the Rangers, and he'll lead them in their most successful mission, the attack or the capture of Kelly and Crook. And then he's in great pain then because he has a broken ankle just 6 weeks before. So we'll talk a little bit about that later, but there he is. Now this picture identified, I asked Bob here, I think I've shown you before. When I got the
Who is it?
Welton. Now Bob, when I got the pictures from Ben Ritter, it was identified as Welton. So I'm just going to put him up there today. But I know Bob, and I probably agree with him, it's not him.
Okay.
But Welton, of course, he lives near Petersburg, and he's going to be second lieutenant right after Jesse McNeill. And he's going to be involved in a lot of action during the course. When Jesse McNeill's injured later in the war, he takes over as commander for maybe 6-7 week period of time. He is a tough guy, and he's going to be hurt bad in the fight at the graveyard in Moorefield in September. I think it's September 9th, 1863. But he's going to be hurt bad then, and I think he's captured maybe a couple times and gets away. But he's a bane to the swamp dragons. As when the early part of the 1862 part into 1863, you don't have much swamp dragon activity. Now, swamp dragons is just a name for the Union people who formed militia companies. Later they became home guards. But all these people knew one another. They lived close to one another and did business before the war and so on. And as the war goes on, we'll see in a moment, the bad blood, it becomes more like Missouri than it is a for-profit operation as they start getting revenge for some of these actions they take. But Welton is one of the mainstays, and we talked about the fight at Parsons Hill as the Rangers are coming back with Crook and Kelly. Jesse McNeill leaves Welton behind, and don't let them ride over you. And they fight there. Primarily they're successful because the two Union cavalry officers are cavalrymen, but there had been no cavalry in Cumberland. And so they put about 30 or 40 Ohio soldiers on horses and led them, they've already passed 40-some miles. They've had enough of that. And when they're ordered to charge, they hold back. And the two officers go in. And that's where the fight starts, and one of them's captured and one of them gets away. So Welton, from the Petersburg area, and a good fighter and one of the best. Now I don't have a picture of the next man, Bernard Dolan. And Dolan was a young man from Wheeling. And his most famous accomplishment, and I'm talking about officers now, his most famous accomplishment was the Piedmont Raid, the attack on the roundhouse in B&O property at Piedmont. Of course, McNeill is leading the raid, McNeill and John Pierce. But Dolan, at Bloomington, he will get on a train or get on a engine and take the engine and a couple soldiers behind him, and McNeill follows them in, and they capture Piedmont and destroy it. Now, Piedmont was like Martinsburg. Martinsburg's about 100 miles from Baltimore. It was a railroad center with oiling up the trains, and it came in and everything. Piedmont was the next 100 miles, more or less. And it was the same setup. They got in there, there was only about 15 soldiers guarding the place. Does anyone know why? Franz Sigel had pulled off most of the soldiers guarding the line and taken to Martinsburg to get ready to advance down the Shenandoah Valley, or up the Shenandoah Valley. So there's only 15 men there. They destroy about 8 locomotives. They set fire to everything. The only people that give them any problem are the women of the town. They try to burn the town's bridge across the Potomac River, or the North Branch, and the women run out and keep putting out the flames. But I talked about the swamp dragons. Dolan is going to be killed at Johnson's Run near Petersburg, and that's in June 1864. A swamp dragon wagon train, they've been to New Creek or Kaiser to resupply. They're coming back, 6 or 7 wagons, and there's an ambush around Johnson's Run, just south of Petersburg. And in this ambush, the Dolan is killed. And he's one of the most trusted men at that time. So the next day, there's some fighting there, and that day, but the next day they go back for his body. And when they ride into town, or towards town, they're warned the swamp dragons are up on that hill where Bob used to live. They're waiting on him. And so the McNeill's men, they make a circuitous route and get behind them and come in. You won't find too many instances where they take any swamp dragons captive. It's all like that from then on. But Dolan, the Wheeling papers a few days later say we got the word that Barney Dolan has been killed. He was a deluded youth who marched out of here with Schreiber Graves years ago. But he was in a lot of action. Next. Now, if the stories are true about him in the last year of the war, this is the man that would be McNeill's Josie Wales. You remember the movie with Clint Eastwood? Clint Eastwood?
Yeah.
Van Diver is a tough guy, big guy. Later on, when he captured General Crook, Crook thought he was Rosser. He said he was Rosser when he went in there, that he was General Rosser. He's wounded in the fighting near Burlington. There was a big wagon train fight in November 1863, just south of Burlington, near the Fort Hill, I think the Fort Hill Farm and the Pierce Farm. The wagon train's a mile long. It's going to resupply General Averill, who is south of there near Petersburg. In this fight, he gets a serious wound, so he's out for a while. But by the end of the war, or maybe not really that long, he's back into the mix. He doesn't take prisoners after Dolan's killed. He doesn't take any prisoners. There's a man named Vallandigham, or young man, that joins the Rangers in 1864. And he tells the story that the Kellys, this would be in November 1864. Kelly's son, General Kelly's son, Tappan Kelly Wright, or Tappan Wright Kelly, has a group of soldiers that are hunting the Rangers all the time. He's only a 20-year-old captain, and they're there to kill them. And they end up murdering 2 civilians. Woodrow was related to one of the civilians.
My great-great-grandfather, they murdered him.
They murdered him.
And a man named Seymour.
Right.
Now, that was the guys under Kelly
Under Tappan Wright Kelly.
that were hunting McNeill.
They were hunting McNeill. They were out to kill McNeill.
So they killed 2 of them.
Kelly's Tigers,
Yeah.
Kelly's Tigers.
Kelly's Tigers.
They got my grandfather too.
Yeah.
Reese,
Was he a civilian?
yeah,
Yeah.
80 years old.
My
In his
great-great-grandfather
front,
was
in
a
his front
civilian,
yard.
and they were looking for the horses. They were
80 years old,
camp.
they killed him.
Right.
And they told him, you got about a half hour to get out of there. And then they left, they followed him and said, if you want to know about your horses, you have to go to New Creek.
Mm-hmm.
So they turned around and went with them, they shot him and left him lay on the road.
When they found them, and the word got back to McNeill, Van Diver takes a patrol and goes after anyone he thinks is involved in it. And he finds some of the swamp dragons at home, and they capture 3 of them. And one of their wives gives them away, and she hollers, they didn't do it. They already, what did they do then? So they're taking them back to Petersburg, and they stop to get Applejack, the Rangers' favorite drink, and they're drinking and having a good time, and of course the guys are really nervous. And Van Diver tells them all, take a drink because you'll need it for a long trip. And Van Landingham says he's one of the young ones, and when they get towards the Petersburg Gap, a couple miles from Petersburg Gap, they say, or Van Diver tells them, Van Diver, on the same home, he tells them, ride on up ahead and watch up there at the crossing. And they go ahead, and he and a few others take these 3 men up a draw and shoot them. But he's in a couple of different things. Out at near Burlington, they captured 2 deserters from the 7th Virginia Cavalry I think their name's High, 2 brothers. And the papers in Rockingham County say they were shot while trying to escape. And then there's another incident with the swamp dragons. Some of the swamp dragons come off the mountains and raid Petersburg, mostly stealing food and things like that. And Van Diver goes after them and ambushes them top, but they don't take any prisoners after Dolan is killed. But he's also one of the mainstays in the Crook Kelly capture. He captures General Crook, and he lives after the war. Even though these men get paroles, after the war he disappears for about 7 years. And he ends up down around Berryville. He was a horse doctor, and in the 1890s he gives some interviews, and who knows how truthful they are, but he was the real deal. He's in on he captures he captures Crook.
Where did those interviews appear in? A newspaper?
I have some, yeah. They're in newspapers. Ben Ritter got a lot of stuff. I might have got it here, but I might have found it myself because everything's online now. Yeah. So now we're coming in a couple. Let's go to the next one. We're going to come into the people who were the writers of this group. Those were the officers. Now, Mosby's well known, all kinds of books have been written about him, movies have been made about him, a famous television series. Why not McNeill? Well, it's a couple different reasons. McNeill died. He didn't live to write a book. Mosby was a classical scholar plus a lawyer. He knew how to write. He knew how to present a case. And the men with Mosby, almost everyone wrote down what had happened. Books, magazine articles, and plus they're in that DC area where everything's in the paper.
Major media market.
Yeah, the grade goes. Where McNeill does with just 70 or 80 men, the same thing that Mosby doing with 200 or 300. Wagon train raids, robbing railroads, and so on. But some of the men with him did write a lot. Jefferson Duffy, who later became a minister, he wrote years later McNeill's Last Charge and the Kidnapping of the Generals. But these are small books, but they do have a lot of useful information in them. That they're written sometime after the war, and he wrote some other articles in papers too, especially about the time he was in Martinsburg and they chased him and his horse fell down and as he rounded the corner there on Queen Street in King. But he's probably maybe the most well-known writer. Okay, next. This is the best information you can get on McNeill in 1864. Henry Trueheart was a Texan who fought at Galveston Bay, the battle down there, the big battle that, trying to think of the general. They sent down there to Magruder from that Lee sent to Texas to get him out of Virginia. But he fought in the Battle of Galveston. He came back to Virginia. They were somehow connected to Virginia, the Truehearts. He fought with the 7th Virginia Cavalry, and he got wounded. And while he was recovering in Harrisonburg, he said, well, why not go with McNeill where I can make some money? And so in 1864, he writes a series of letters in 1864 and 1865. He writes a series of letters to his brothers and sisters and tells what's going on. It's current information. It's right that day. What McNeill's sick today. And one of his best letters describes how they operated, how they kept moving. Now Mosby would send his men out and they would live at different farms and in different villages, and then he would send the word to meet at one place. McNeill kept his men together at all times. And he would say how they would go to a farm and they would stay there that night, but they would have their scouts out and every road would be watched so they wouldn't be cornered. And he ends up marrying one of the Cunninghams from the Petersburg area. I think, Bob, you took us out to their house at one time. And but he is the best. If you can find that book somewhere, if you're really interested in McNeill, it's on the internet, probably $7, $8 now. And he sold a lot of copies. I talked to him. He lived down in Texas, and Texas A&M University put this out.
He doesn't have any connection to the Williamses up here, does he?
I don't know. I don't think he did. I think he just ran into that story down there.
Did you ever go down to the Rosenberg Library and look to see what else is in there?
No.
Because all their family papers are in there, and they were very wealthy.
Yeah.
And they had tons and tons of papers apparently in there. And these are just some, he even says it's select.
Yeah.
It's not all of them.
But he's the best. Now, next. John Fay. If you want to study somebody's writings that has a lot of good information, but he's writing just a little bit later, this is one. He wrote a lot of articles. He was a newspaper editor later after the war up in Oakland, Maryland. And he joins the Rangers just before the attack on the graveyard at Moorefield on September 9th, 1863, and he stays with them the rest of the war. And he probably, where he was a newspaper man, he kept a lot of notes, maybe a diary, wherever it is, who knows if it even existed. But he's great on his later writings. He is the one who leads the Rangers into Cumberland to kidnap the generals. He is the one. And he writes a lot of articles about it after the war, but doesn't always use his name. He'll give himself an assumed name. But he's kind of an intellectual person like Mosby, and kind of says he's corrected Jesse McNeill many times. You know, he will correct him at certain times. But he ends up being a government employee in Virginia somewhere. But he's in most of the fighting those last 2 years. Okay, next. Here's William Maloney. Now, if you read the History of Hampshire County, it was written back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, he's probably the person that's given most of the information, because he is in a lot of the stories. He is in a lot of stories. Now, he joins up before the Gettysburg campaign. He joins up right before the Gettysburg campaign. And he's in the rest of the war. So I think he's 17 or 18 when he joins up, so he's probably like 19 when he finishes. And he is wounded badly at the fight at the graveyard in Moorefield. Badly wounded. The Van Meter diary, she notes that Welton and Malona were wounded in the fight. And he appears again a long time afterwards. And it's the next year he pops up again with the Averill's raid, when he catches McCausland in Moorefield. But as Averill comes through here, you know, Averill's McCausland burns Chambersburg, and they're going through here, and they hit a couple days later, and they're going to attack Kaiser, New Creek. Maloney is here, and he's down around the bridge somewhere, crossing, and he spots them, and he goes along the Trough Road and picks up one of the Parsons, and they head into Moorefield. And at Moorefield, they find McCausland, and they tell him what's going to happen. And McCausland does send out some scouts with orders to Bradley Johnson, who's up at Willow Wall, to send some scouts out, but they can't find Averill's men. And then at daylight, Averill's men ride in and capture over 400 Confederates and kill a number of them. Maloney's in town, and I think he's at McNeill. He stays there that night, and he's getting ready to go out and get on his horse, and one of the servant girls comes in. Mr. Maloney, you got to go. The Yankees are coming. But he's in that, and he's also in the story about Stump getting killed. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But he's staying down there, I think, at the Parsons Hill house that morning, and he's still probably in rough shape. He was wounded bad there. And somehow when the scouts come in, these men are killers. We'll talk about it a little bit when we talk about Stump. But they come in, and he picks up a Sunday school quarterly and starts reading it. And they rough him up a little bit, but then the officer comes in and frees him. But he tells about that story, and he's in on the raid to capture Kelly Crook. They talk about him in there.
We some of you already know this. When the family donated his revolver his little medicine kit, his medals from the various McNeill reunions that are in a case in the museum. Very fortunate to have that.
Yeah, and he was justice of the peace here,
30 years.
many of you know.
He's
So
referred to as Squire Maloney.
when those writers were here interviewing people, he was the one that was telling most stories. Because he's in a lot of stories. Now, not all of them, but he's telling his side, that's for sure. But he's right there at the end. He goes all the way. Next one. John Lynn. Now, many of you have heard the story that the capture of Crook and Kelly was planned because John McNeill's wife had been taken by Kelly about a year before, captured at the railroad station in Oakland, and put in Camp Chase, where they kept the civil detainees. And that was one of the reasons. But this was another. The day that they would raid, Sheridan Scouts would raid Moorefield and capture some of the Confederates there, Gilmore. They also picked up Lynn as they're coming up the road. And they picked up 5 other Confederates of the McNeill Rangers. They took them to Fort McHenry and put them in chains. So the idea was, if we go into Cumberland and come out with these men, then we'll trade them. We'll trade them. Now that didn't happen. They did come out with the generals, but they couldn't trade a private for a general. But they did let him out of their chains. But he was captured along the Trough Road as the Sheridan Scouts and the rest of the Union Cavalry came this way. Next. Sprig Lynn, he was right there from the start and stayed in command the whole war. He's well known in the capture of Kelly and Crook. He's one of the, the men in that goes to the Barnum House and gets one of the Union guards. He didn't have enough fighting in this war. He was a mercenary. You hear a lot about mercenaries later on. Now, I mean, there's mercenaries in the Ukraine on both sides. Sprig Lynn was a mercenary in Cuba. He was killed in Cuba right before the United States went into the Spanish-American War. So he had to be at least in his 50s. He was killed. The paper here reported, word has been received that Sprig Lynn of Cumberland was killed in action in Cuba. But family very proud of him. I know some of the family there. But he was a mercenary at the end. He didn't get enough fighting with McNeill. Okay, go through here quickly. James Daly, the one on the left, he's in from the start in September 1862. He goes all the way through. He leads in the attack on Oakland during the Jones and Bowdoin raid. He leads the Rangers into Oakland because he's from there. That's his hometown. His sister is a girlfriend of General Crook and will later marry her right after the war.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, then, as Woodrow said, Daly's in the whole war with him, and his family's in the hotel business. That's how Mary Daly becomes enamored with George Crook. And after the war, a few years after the war, probably about 1872 or so, Daly is hired, is one of the packers or guides that accompanied Crook in his campaigns against the Apaches. And they go with, he fought with the South, and then he can't join the Army, I guess, but they hire him as a packer. It's a little bit like Custer has his brothers and his brother and nephew along at the Little Bighorn, and all they are is packers there. So Daly's pretty important, well known at the time. He dies about 18 82. Next, Richie Haller. They picked him up in Pennsylvania when they were in Mercersburg, Pennsylvania, and Haller became one of their most trusted scouts. He's in the painting right back there as coming into town. But he was from Missouri. When they came into Mercersburg, he said, I'll show you where these people have hidden all their stuff if you take me along. And they did.
He was only 16?
16 or so, yeah.
And has there anybody ever found a connection between McNeill and he and his family out in Missouri?
No, I don't think so. And later on, he goes back out there, and he's going to become a druggist out there. He lives into the late 1920s.
Cephas was his first name.
Cephas,
Yeah.
Richie Howell. And next, we move along here, because I don't know. This is the first time I did this, so it might be a little long. John Pierce, this is the most interesting person I've found. Now, these are other people that rode with McNeill. They're not McNeill Rangers, but they rode with him a lot, especially this guy, John Pierce. He lives along the road from Burlington to Petersburg. He's a well-educated man. This picture is when he's in the West Virginia legislature. He's a well-educated man,
Yeah.
and he's a builder. He's an architect. He can do a lot of things. And Pierce is in on the raid at Bloomington and Piedmont on the B&O. He tells Mrs. Lou Wallace and the other ladies on the ladies' car, you don't have to be afraid of Virginians. You don't have to be afraid of us. We have the most beautiful women in Virginia. And okay, but he's wounded a couple times during the war. When he's with the 7th Virginia Cavalry, but he's always at home. His home is near Fort Hill, and I've been there a few times. And he's in on the Bloomington raid. He's in on the fight there at his own house, because the newspaper report that rebel John Pierce was leading the charge. And after the war, he tries to get a pardon from President Johnson. The people in what's now Mineral County write in, they say, this is the worst horse thief in the area. The governor of West Virginia, Arthur I. Borman, writes in, don't give him a pardon. Okay, who writes his letter of recommendation? George Crook writes him a letter of recommendation. This man treated me very well. Now, he wasn't in on the original kidnapping, but he helped guard him after they got to Moorefield. And after the war, there's trouble with the Corskadens up around New Creek over stolen horses, stolen cattle, and they had the sheriff collect his cattle when they're up on one of the mountains up there, and the case goes all the way to the Supreme Court, U.S. Supreme Court, and Pierce wins. But he is an interesting character. He was a loner, but he would show up at certain times, and just before the fight at Burlington, Van Meter writes, Miss Van Meter writes, John Pierce was driving a herd of hogs through here, and he met McNeill, and they took off. So, but he is really interesting. Next one, Stump did ride with him, the big hay train capture right out at Junction. And could anybody tell me why Sheridan's scouts had him marked for execution? I've looked and looked for that. They had a death sentence on him, but Sheridan had told him to kill him. Well, why? He had been wounded. He was just recovering from a wound.
Supposedly, the one thing I read was, and it was written by a Union soldier,
Yeah.
that was involved with it, that they told him, we're gonna kill you, but we won't cut your throat like you do
Yeah.
Union soldiers, in
Yeah.
other words.
Yeah,
And we'll give you a start.
yeah.
And they shot him. And then a little bit of a story, Charles Bonhoeffer
Okay.
is related to,
Okay.
or descended somehow from this country.
And he's in Fort Hill, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he said that they finished him off beating him to death with a fence rail.
Mm-hmm.
And what?
They beat him to death with a fence rail after he was wounded.
Yeah, they picked,
And that the fence rail was in the family for years, and it somehow,
Major Young, when they told him that Stump was wounded, they told Major Young, they said he's sick, he said make him sicker. And so,
Gilmore,
but there's some, Gilmore, now
Gilmore
they had,
actually liked Young.
yeah,
He had nothing but good to say about Young.
Gilmore, the famous partisan and cavalier, had burned Chambersburg. 550, he was McCausland's maybe main arsonist. He didn't want to do it, but he said go ahead and do it anyway. But they had captured Gilmore earlier that morning. And I've always thought, why, if anyone should have had the death sentence, it should have been Gilmore. What had Stump done? I knew they said he had cut someone's throat, but there's no other evidence he did. Yeah.
The only thing that I've ever, and I've never read what you read there, Jay, but the only thing I've ever heard is that, he was a notorious fighter.
Yeah.
He'd been in a lot of scraps. Who was it? Was it Rosser or Lee or somebody nicknamed him Stump's Battery?
Yeah, because he carried so
Because he
many
carried
weapons.
so many pistols. He
Okay.
never ran out of ammunition.
Okay, just a couple more. We'll wrap her up. Next one. Now I found out something while I was making this. Down around Berkeley Springs, they spell Kirkendall with an H.
Yeah, it's, phonetically, it's C-O-E-Y and.
Yeah, all the Kirkendalls in this valley.
Yeah.
It's spelled like that.
And we have a first-hand authority.
Oh, yeah, right.
But yeah, so, I mean, the German way would have been with the H, I would think.
D-H-L.
Or the
Okay.
Dutch, whatever.
Well, him quickly, he would ride with the Rangers from time to time, and for some reason, Jesse McNeill is going, and John Fay are going to give him the duty to capture Kelly. Now, when he goes into the room, he introduces himself, and Kelly, or something like, "Do you remember me?" Kelly had sent him to prison at Camp Chase a few years before. I think he said he did remember him. But Kirkendalls did ride with him every so often, or they rode with them. And back and forth, I guess they didn't take too many orders, they did what they wanted. But this is one of the Garnet Jex paintings showing the capture. Next one. Here, this guy sitting in the front row, Charles Woodson, he was from Missouri. And he was captured out there in 1863. They emptied the prison at Point Lookout, for Delaware. And you had men that had been captured in Missouri, they couldn't go home. What were you going to do to them, with them? So they sent them to Harrisonburg. They end up at Harrisonburg. They're not all in the same, they weren't all from the same unit, but they formed a unit. They went into the 62nd Virginia Cavalry, but they didn't have 62nd Virginia Infantry, but they didn't have any horses. They wanted horses, and finally McNeill in the summer of 1864 captures some horses, and they give them to these men, about 60 or 70 of them. And they ride with McNeill and form another strike force there the last 6-7 months of the war. And some of the Rangers want Woodson to be put in charge after the death of John Hanson. He goes to Missouri after the war, but you can't believe too much of what he said. He was afraid of assassination. Remember Jesse James walked in some bank, the first bank or something they robbed, and he thought the cashier was some lieutenant or something that had killed one of his friends and went ahead and shot him. So he lived in a union area where his wife was from a union area. So when he went back, he put his head down, and if someone asked him something, he'd say,
Well, eventually, he did make some statements and do some writing.
yeah,
And what he said at that time was, he's the one who captured
Yeah.
Kelly
yeah.
and Crook.
He wasn't there. No,
He wasn't there, he still said.
no, he was at the rear guard and down in
The craziest thing involving him is when he was exchanged and he got permission to form his company, they were in line at the Battle of Newmarket.
Right.
And they literally charged on the right flank of the VMI cadets and everything into the face of artillery with pistols.
Yeah,
They lost 60% of their men in that battle.
yeah.
That was before they joined.
Before they joined. Okay, last couple pictures. Here they are at the end of the war. See how well they're dressed.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's
The
a good
boots.
picture, that's a good picture.
Yeah.
See how well they're dressed.
GQ.
You see,
6 months to get a pair of
Yeah.
boots like that toward the
I
end
think
of
they
the
had
war.
the boots on.
You see up there, there's Charles Daly
Bailey on the left, top
Yeah.
left.
Yeah.
and Jesse McNeill on the bottom right.
Yeah, who's in the
Faye.
middle, yeah, who's in the middle at the bottom?
I don't know whether it's true heart or not. The three that's been identified are Daly, Faye, and McNeill. I thought maybe some of y'all would know.
Which, so you got Daly on top left, then who?
Faye's in the middle at the bottom. Jesse McNeill's
Yeah,
on the right.
That makes sense.
Yeah,
And Jesse McNeill on the right.
right.
Has any of those identities were contemporaneously identified, like an old photograph that had it marked at that?
Not that I know.
So Faye looks for sure, Daly looks for sure. I'm not sure about Jesse.
I think Jesse's in the middle.
Really? Jesse, they always said Jesse's on, that's his
I
profile.
know that looks like Faye.
Donnie Nolan had on
Is
it.
that the same picture that was,
That looks like Jesse.
had a man named,
Yeah,
I
that's
think
it.
Freeman Gosden?
Who?
Freeman Gosden, I believe it was, who was the father of the actor who played
Amos and Andy?
Amos Andy.
Seriously?
And he
Jameson.
now, I don't know whether that's a picture,
I don't know.
but there is a picture, a group picture that identifies him.
Yeah.
I can tell.
Okay, the last one then is just the cover of the book. And there you are in Romney. But all these men are almost forgotten, except in this area of the country. Just in this area, if you go down to Petersburg, they'll know the ones from Petersburg, or if you go to Moorefield or Romney, they know them. But where Mosby's men, they're still pretty well known among Civil War people that read books and things like that.
Yeah, there's a big Mosby group out of Virginia.
Right.
That has a newsletter.
Right.
I subscribe to. They're big into all that.
Yeah.
And if you compare the numbers, really line it up, they did man for man.
Oh, yeah.
Way more than Mosby
Yeah.
did.
Did they?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Steve,
But
have you,
Mosby did a lot himself, just by himself.